Hello, and initially this talk was delivered down in Abingdon in November 2024. However, there was something wrong with the recording, and so I've agreed to record this for those of you who are following it at home. And so this was entitled 1944, Breaking into Fortress Europe, covering the 5th of July 1943 to the 6th of June 1944. Now, by 5th of July 1943, there was no doubt who had lost the war. Germany was run out of men, supplies, especially fuel, and food. Now, the Luftwaffe had been devastated. The U-boat menace had been defeated. The German army decimated at Stalingrad and Tunis. Italy faced starvation and had lost its Eastern and North African empires. The Middle East was firmly under British rule, and Iran occupied by the Soviets and the British. The Red Army had recovered and learned to fight. The Americans were in the war, and the bombing campaign of Germany was stepping up. Any sane government would have long ago sought terms, but Hitler was determined to fight on. Now, with the Africa campaign over, Churchill and Brooke wanted a Mediterranean strategy, when the US were determined to land in France, or it would send the troops instead to the Far East. Now, Brooke argued an Italian invasion would either tie up German forces, bringing them in from France and Russia, or the Germans would have to abandon all of Italy south of the River Po, and this would knock Italy out of the war. Also, controlling the Mediterranean would significantly shorten Britain's routes to the Far East and would save 1 million tons of shipping a year. Britain and the US agreed to reach a compromise. There would be an invasion of Italy, but 29 divisions would stay in Britain to prepare for the invasion of France. And after Sicily fell, 7 divisions would return to Britain for the cross-channel attack. This was insisted upon by the US General George Marshall. Stalin was furious at the Sicily-Italy plan. He didn't want the British near the Balkans, and he wanted a France landing in 1943. The US had suggested a France landing in 1942. Churchill, despite opposing the idea, had suggested they might try it in 1943, which was never possible with the available ships and aircraft. Now, in the east, as we can see from this map, German forces had been planning to attack at Kursk. And so we've got here on this map, this is the Eastern Front for the 1st of August 1943, and spoiler alert, we'll see what's going to happen to it until the 31st of December 1944. We have here Brooke and Marshall, who we've just discussed, and here we have the map of the Kursk offensive, Operation Citadel. And so the Germans have been planning this attack since April 1943, but delay had followed delay. Hitler was uncharacteristically nervous about the offensive. It had been due to begin in May, but Hitler wanted to wait for the new Panther tank to enter service, and that had been delayed by RAF bombing. He was right to worry. The risk of this offensive was huge. The Red Army had called up 300,000 civilians to build 8 lines of defences. Anyone looking at the map could see that Kursk would be attacked, and the Soviets were well aware of the German build-up. British ultra-intelligence had identified the Luftwaffe bases, and they passed this information to the Soviets. The Luftwaffe would concentrate 2,000 planes for the battle, stripping the rest of the Eastern Front. But the Red Army would destroy 500 of these on the ground before the battle even began. The Luftwaffe was also now desperately short of fuel. The Soviets repaired 9,000 kilometers of trenches and 1.9 million men for the battle. At the rear of the salient was a reserve force led by Konev with another 575,000 men. They had over 5,000 tanks and 25,000 artillery pieces. Against this, Germany had 780,000 men, under 3,000 tanks, and less than 10,000 artillery pieces. Now, the German assault would be led by excellent Tiger wedges. You can see here the Tiger and the Panther tanks, but the Panzer divisions had only been brought up to strength by retraining Luftwaffe ground crews. The divisions were short of equipment. The SS Das Reich division even had a company equipped with captured T-34 tanks. The supply chains were difficult for Germany, as partisans in Belarus and the forests south of Leningrad were an increasing problem. Worse, a captured German soldier revealed to the Soviets the very timing of the H hour, 3 a.m. At 3 a.m., the Soviets hit the advancing German forces with a huge artillery barrage, delaying the attack by 2 hours. The lines were then hit by a thunderstorm. It wasn't the best of starts. At 5 in the morning, a huge air battle broke out over Kursk. German tanks pushed forward, but Panthers were breaking down, and in some cases were even catching fire. Stukas devastated poorly hidden Soviet tank forces, but the anti-tank guns were harder to spot. In the air, there was some desperate Soviet pilots which rammed German aircraft, but the Luftwaffe was slowly getting the better of the fight. The German forces clawed their way forwards 10 kilometers. Soviet anti-tank rounds were bouncing off the Tiger tanks. Targets were so plentiful that some Tiger tank loaders collapsed with fatigue. One Tiger killed 22 T-34s in an hour. The fighting was intense. We have here a picture of the Kursk battlefield. On the 6th of July, the Germans started to break through the Soviet second line. By the 8th of July, the fierce fighting was still continuing. German troops were having to take tablets to stay awake. General Model threw his reserves into the battle, but Soviet numbers were too great, and the Sturmovik ground attack aircraft was taking its toll. Model had already lost 20,000 men and around 200 tanks. The Germans were making better progress, however, in the southern thrust. The Soviets had expected the main thrust from the north and had concentrated there. But the reverse was actually true. Even so, as Hoff advanced from the south, as soon as he destroyed one Soviet division, he found another in his way. The Luftwaffe were being hampered in the number of sorties they could fly by fuel shortages, and slowly the Red Air Force was gaining control of the air. On the 9th of July, the 2nd SS Panzer Division started to attack the last line of defense in the south. By the 10th, German forces, led by Strachwitz, could see their target, a place called Abingdon in the distance. Now, in 1914, Strachwitz had been a cavalryman on the Western Front, and he'd been able to see Paris in the distance just before they started to dig the trenches. He said the feeling of seeing Abingdon in distance was very similar to that feeling of seeing Paris in distance, close enough to see, but too far to reach. That same day, the Allies landed in Sicily. Now, by the 12th of July, a breakthrough seemed possible in Kursk, as Army Detachment Kempf threatened the rear of the Soviet 5th Guards tank army. Their advance had been led by captured T-34s, but the Luftwaffe had accidentally bombed them. Then Hoff and by now Hoff had lost 406 of his 916 panzers. That day, the Soviets counterattacked. So mixed up the two forces that aircraft and artillery couldn't help either side. T-34s with infantry riding on top charged against the panzers. So close was the fighting that tanks rammed each other. It's known as the battle, and you'll have to excuse the pronunciation, the Battle of Prokhorovka. Now, further north that day, the Soviets launched an offensive of their own towards Orel. The German front was now at great risk, and Hitler ordered Citadel to be cancelled to transfer some troops away from the Eastern Front, despite the crisis of the opening Soviet offensive, to try and fight in Italy. But Manstein wanted the Kursk battle to continue for now, as it was holding huge Soviet forces in place, and he wanted time to reorganize the German defensive lines. But on the 17th, Citadel was finally cancelled, and the troops began to be withdrawn from the battle. The same day, Soviet troops started a new offensive further to the south, towards the Sea of Azov. Sorry, I'm having to record this at work on my own just because the recording failed. I do apologize that the pictures went everywhere there for a minute. So here we can see the IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft that did so much damage to the German forces. And here we have a map of Sicily. Now, the Sicily invasion began on the 10th of July at 2 in the morning, and they called it Operation Husky. Eisenhower considered cancelling it when he discovered that 2 German divisions had arrived in Sicily, to the scorn of Churchill, who pointed out that there'd be a lot more than 2 German divisions waiting for them in France. Now, the initial plan had been for multiple small landings to make resupply easier. Monty, however, wanted a concentration of force in the southeast of the island, with the US 7th Army as his flank guard. It began with a series of airdrops across the island. Then 2,600 ships landed 8 divisions. That's the same number as was landed at D-Day. By nightfall, there were 80,000 men, 3,000 vehicles, 300 tanks, and 900 guns ashore. The Germans were surprised as Operation Mincemeat, which involved a dead Royal Marines officer, had led Hitler to believe that the landings were to be in Greece and Sardinia instead. Now, Kesselring hadn't been fooled, and he'd told Hitler they're going for Sicily, but he'd been overruled. Mussolini had also been convinced they were going for Sicily and had reinforced the island. Now, high winds made the paratroop landings chaotic, and the beaches were mined. The British glider force, aiming for a key bridge south of Syracuse, Point Grande, suffered worse due to poor navigation. One glider landed at Malta, another at Tunis. 60 crashed into the sea. 30 men, however, reached the bridge and seized it. They were joined slowly by another 50 throughout the day. After fierce fighting, there were only 15 of this force left, and the bridge was retaken by the Germans. But the bridge was soon recaptured by the Royal Scots Fusiliers advancing from the beach. Of the 600 casualties, half had drowned. Now, Sicily itself was defended by 300,000 men, but they weren't expecting an invasion just yet due to the storm at sea. And only 2 of the divisions there were German. There's the Hermann Goering Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier. Even so, the US 1st Division landed, seized the Gela airfield, and were then hit by a fierce counterattack by the Hermann Goering Division. US Shermans had not yet landed. Italian infantry attacks on the beaches, however, were halted by phosphorus bombs from mortars and naval gunfire, with the phosphorus, which is a cruel and terrible weapon, directed in person by Patton. The Germans came close to seizing the beaches and believed that the US would soon re-embark before some Sherman tanks and some 155mm long Tom artillery were landed. Firing over open sights, the artillery just stopped the Germans from seizing the beach. Tigers also attacked the American paratroopers in a vineyard around the Biasa Ridge. Now, the Paras again looked like being overrun as their light anti-tank weapons couldn't harm the Tigers. But a naval ensign called down point-blank naval fire directly on top of the heads of the Germans, who were mere yards away from the paratroopers. The paratroopers were terrified and rightly furious, but it saved them from the advancing German armor. It certainly takes a lot of trust to be able to bring down naval gunfire from such distance to so close a target. Now, the Tigers were driven off, and one was captured after its crew got out for a smoke and were then ambushed. Patton tried to cancel further paratroop drops as cooperation between the American Army and the Air Force was so poor. The US Air Force refused to fly fighters over the beaches as American anti-aircraft units kept on shooting at their own fighters. But the US anti-aircraft gunmen were angry at a lack of fighter cover, so both sides blamed the other. It was too late to cancel the paratroop drops, however, and as the paratroopers went over the American forces, American anti-aircraft guns opened up on their own paratroopers. Even after the American paratroopers had landed, the American anti-aircraft guns continued to blaze away at them. 23 American planes were shot down and 37 damaged by their own side, for the loss of 400 casualties in what is one terrible incident. However, despite this, the British seized Syracuse after only light resistance and started to advance on Catania on the way to Messina to try and trap the Axis forces on the island. The Hermann Goering Division halted its attacks against the Americans to move to block the British, and resistance became fiercer. We can just move the picture on one more time. I'm sorry that it's being done so clunky, but they lost the recording. Here we go. We can see here the Pont Grande Bridge seized in Operation Ladbroke. And so the Hermann Goering force halted its attacks on the Americans to move to block the British, and resistance became fiercer. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had also arrived on the island, and the German General Hube was sent to try and hold Messina to prevent another Tunis-style surrender. On the 13th of July, another British para dropped to capture Primiol Bridge near Catania. Again, the invasion fleet fired on them. So as the aircraft went over the top, the anti-aircraft guns from the invasion fleet hammered away, causing chaos. of the 1,856 men of the 1st Para Brigade, only 300 actually reached their landing zone. Even so, they took the bridge and removed the demolition charges from it. The German paratroopers, the German 4th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, attacked and nearly retook the bridge, but the British just managed to hold on before being relieved by the Durham Light Infantry, who had force marched 40 kilometres in full kit in 35 degrees C heat, despite being bombed en route by both American and German aircraft. Having arrived, they then were launched straight into the attack against German machine guns. The River Semeto ran literally red with blood, but the bridge, the crucial bridge, was saved. Ammunition was low, and German snipers were picking off the stretcher teams. But the fighting continued. Meanwhile, the 51st Highlanders attacked the hilltop village of Francoforte. It was taken, but the advance was halted by the Hermann Goering Division at the airfield of Gembini. The British 13th Corps was blocked, while 30 Corps was having to fight from ridge to ridge. Monty decided to send 30 Corps through the American area to flank Mount Etna, but Bradley, the American general, and Patton were absolutely furious with the British because they'd entered their zone. Bradley wanted to officially complain, but both were involved in a scandal where 70 German prisoners of war had been massacred, and so they wisely kept quiet. They're both convinced, the reason why they're angry is they're both convinced the British are trying to steal glory away from the American army. Patton's troops advanced and captured the port of Agrento on the west coast, and then pushed towards Palermo. As they were fully motorized and had self-propelled artillery, they moved much faster than the British, whose commanders seemed baffled by the ridgeline fighting. They were experienced from the desert, but this ridge, followed by ridge after ridge, seems to really confuse them. It took them a long time to adapt. On the 17th of July, Patton heard that Alexander and Monty still expected the US to be just flank guards. With the Anglophobic General Wedemeyer then spoke to Alexander and got his permission to loose the American troops. He said the American troops shouldn't be held back by the British anymore, just release them across Sicily. The Sicilian civilians, meanwhile, were starving. US MPs opened fire with machine guns on food rioters, while VD, as it was called, sexually transmitted disease cases, VD cases soared as women did what they could to earn food. On the 19th of July, Hitler and Mussolini met. Hitler lectured Mussolini for 2 hours on the Italian deficiencies. During the meeting, the railway yards near Rome were bombed for the first time, causing panic in the city. Hitler sent tanks to the Black Shirt militia in case they needed to put down any anti-fascist uprisings in Italy. Now, in the skies over Germany, the bombing campaign continued, and German morale was crumbling. Catholic Germans had believed the destruction of Cologne, there we go, here's Cologne Cathedral. Germans believed that the destruction of Cologne was a sign from God that they were being punished, and it was revenge for the destruction of the synagogues. In alarm, Goebbels stopped showing pictures of the ruins. It dejected more than angered the population. It started by showing the Germans these pictures, thinking it would make them furious and determined to fight on. But no, it just made them very, very dejected. The Ruhr was, however, now too well defended for further Allied bombing raids. So on the 24th of July, Hamburg was bombed again. For the first time, aluminium foil called Window was dropped to confuse German radar. The British bombed by night, the Americans by day. We then had Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg. Nazi officials refused to let civilians leave the city. On the 27th, the RAF returned to Hamburg again. It had been the driest, hottest summer in 10 years. And what's going to happen? Here we go. Here's the burning of Hamburg. Even at 17,000 feet, the crews could smell the burning bodies in the firestorm. Tarmac boiled. 40,000 died. To put it into perspective, the British lose around 14,000 in the Blitz. Hamburg loses 40,000 in a night. The shock spreads across Germany. It's referred to as a civilian Stalingrad. On the 29th of July, the RAF attack again. The Germans shoot down 28 bombers using a new tactic, dived bombing down on the bombers from above, using the flames of the burning city of Hamburg below to light up the bombers to make them easy targets. What a bleak way of being able to see your target. On the 2nd of August, the RAF attacked again, but electrical storms caused high losses, with another 30 bombers lost, and the US 8th Air Force was forced to halt its campaign after 87 bombers were lost in a week. Now, returning to the Eastern Front, on the 22nd of July, Hitler gave permission to withdraw from the city of Orel. On the 1st of August, with Kursk won, Stalin makes his only visit to the front. And soon after, on the 3rd of August, Operation Romanstev is launched. 1 million men, 12,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 tanks and self-propelled guns all attack towards German forces in the Orel area. Manstein was not ready for a major assault so soon. And we have here a quote, "For the weary German infantry, it was as if the beaten enemy had risen from the grave with renewed strength." And so on the 5th of August, the Red Army entered Orel. Here we go. We can see Orel just north of the Kursk salient there. On the 18th of August, Bryansk, if you look at it, it's just deeper into towards the Reich, I suppose, from Orel. Bryansk was liberated on the 18th of August, and the Red Army started to approach Kharkov. Germany launched a counterattack, but the Red Army was ready for them. On the 28th of August, Kharkov was liberated. The German army had been battered, losing 50,000 men, but the Red Army had lost 177,000 at Kursk and 250,000 on the drive for Kharkov. The Orel salient battle had cost 430,000 casualties. For every tank the Germans lost, the Russians lost 5. But Germany now had to pull back behind the Dnieper River, which you can see just at the bottom of that map, right at the bottom, near where the box where it says Army Group South, and abandon its bridgehead in the Caucasus to try and free up men for elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Sicily, on the 22nd of July, US troops rolled into Palermo, while Canadian troops of the 1st Division scaled cliffs to seize Asano. On the 24th of July, the fascist Grand Council met in Rome. Mussolini was ill and said nothing as they voted to return to a constitutional monarchy and a democratic parliament. We have here King Emmanuel III of Italy and Marshal Badoglio of the army. On the 25th of July, while Mussolini is ill, Mussolini goes to see King Emmanuel III. When he arrives, he's arrested and the Marshal is made Prime Minister. In Milan, anti-fascist prisoners are released when workers storm the prisons. Even the black shirts with their newly arrived German tanks do nothing as fascism collapses in Italy in hours. Now, Hitler demands that a German paratroop division be dropped on Rome to seize the government and the king and to stop the Freemasons and the Vatican, as he called it, a Freemason and Vatican-inspired coup. Rommel, Jodl, and Kesselring all persuade him against it. Meanwhile, 8 German divisions seize the Brenner Pass and North Italy. On the 25th of July, Patton flies to see Monty, determined to take Messina first and spoiling for a fight with Monty over it. But to his shock, Monty agrees that American troops, of course, could enter the British area to help them reach Messina quickly. And after all, as far as Monty's concerned, he'd rather American troops than British troops die to seize the objective. And so the Americans are made to fight every step of the way. Bridges are blown, and even the dead bodies are booby-trapped. This enrages American troops, who often shoot their prisoners. In the first week of August, there's heavy fighting for Troina, with the US 1st Division suffering 500 casualties. On the 3rd of August, Patton physically assaults a shell-shocked American soldier. A week later, he draws a pistol on another, threatening to shoot him and ranting that shell shock was a Jewish invention. It was a controversy that would run and run. In an effort to win the race to Messina, Patton lands a battalion 15 kilometers behind German lines. It's wiped out, fighting for the key hill of Montepolia. Unknown to Patton, the Germans had already begun to evacuate Sicily. The Allied air forces were busy bombing Rome, and their navies did not want to risk going into the straits between Sicily and Italy and risking the shore guns. Eisenhower refused to land troops in Italy to try and block the retreat, and so criminally, 110,000 Axis troops were allowed to be evacuated from Sicily, mostly, as we said, due to General Marshall's refusal to allow the British to commit to an Italian invasion, as they asked. The Americans are determined that troops must be saved for the invasion of France, and they're worried the British are going to try and suck them into the Balkans for their own political purposes. But that was a criminal decision. On the 17th of August, American troops finally entered Messina. The news of Patton's treatment of his troops broke, but Eisenhower didn't want to lose what was one of his best performing generals. He was made to apologize to his troops, but the 1st Division heard him in rather stony silence. Overall, Sicily was a great victory, and they'd gained valuable amphibious experience. They'd gained their airfields for use against Italy, and they now had control of the Med. In August, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Quebec. Churchill got agreement that the A-bomb project would be a joint venture. Italy was already in secret negotiations via Portugal, and Britain was keen, as was General Hap Arnold, head of the US Air Force. South Italy, he said, would be a great base to bomb the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, as well as the German Reich. Roosevelt wanted forces to halt at Rome in case the British used the Mediterranean fighting as an excuse to delay a French invasion. Churchill, however, wants to invade the island of Rhodes, which he thinks will bring Turkey into the war. Marshall insisted, however, that 7 divisions be agreed to be withdrawn by the 1st of November. Overlord was fixed for May 1944, but Arnold insisted the Luftwaffe be weakened first. Brooke was also told at this stage that he would not be in overall command of D-Day. Eisenhower would, and he was absolutely devastated at being overlooked. On the 3rd of September, a secret Italian armistice was signed. Italy was meant to use its armed forces now against Germany, but it was terrified of German reprisals. There were now 16 German divisions in Italy. British and Canadian troops finally landed at Reggio di Calabria unopposed. The sea is calm. The British referred to it as the Messina Straits Regatta. Landings at Taranto soon followed. 1st Airborne was landed straight into port on board British cruisers in what was a huge risk, but a risk that paid off and certainly allowed British troops to land easily. So here they are, British troops landing in Italy, straight into the port. The Italian fleet sailed to Malta to surrender, although the Italian battleship Roma was sunk by a German rocket-propelled bomb. I'm hoping if I just press this button here we go, we have the sinking of the Roma. The campaign, however, was underprepared, as ultra decrypts had convinced the Allies the Germans wanted to hold the Pisa-Rimini line in the north. Hitler changed his mind, however, so although the ultra decrypts had been accurate when the information was sent, Hitler has changed his mind and decided that he's going to fight for a lot more of Italy than initially he'd decided. And he believes that if he abandons most of Italy, then his Romanian, Croat, and Hungarian allies will also feel abandoned and might leave the war. Now, the Italians had promised to defend Rome against the Germans, but they did absolutely nothing to do so. The US actually considered the landing paratroopers, much like Hitler did. They actually loaded the 82nd Airborne Division onto aircraft to drop on Rome, but cancelled, thankfully, just as the aircraft were taking off, as it would have been an absolute massacre. On the 8th of September, General Clark and the US Fifth Army landed at Salerno, southeast of Naples. Kesselring launched Operation Atch. Even as Rome celebrated the armistice, German paratroopers marched into the city. The king and the marshal, their new prime minister, escaped just in time. Italian soldiers were seized as prisoners of war and sent to forced labor camps, and 8,000 Jews were rounded up in Rome. The newly rebuilt 6th Panzer and part of the German 10th Army seized the Gulf of Salerno to contest the American landings, which were a disaster. Naval support can only begin once the mines were cleared. They weren't expecting resistance, but the Germans were soon joined by that Hermann Goering Division, 15th and 29th Panzer Grenadier. The US General Dowley, here we go, we have a picture of the Salerno landings here. The US General Dowley failed to secure his left flank. The landings were trapped, while German artillery controlled the high ground, although US Rangers could direct naval gunfire to hit the German supply lines. The Germans then launched a major offensive, thinking that they could force the Americans to evacuate the beachhead. As the battle became desperate, Clark did consider evacuating, and the German general, von Weizsäcker, believed he'd won. The British Eighth Army was requested to assist, but their advance up the boot of Italy was slowed by blown bridges and Monty's natural caution. The Royal Navy did what it could, sending the Warspite and Valiant to cover the bridgeheads, while Cunningham sent fast cruisers to Tunis to try and collect reinforcements. The 82nd Airborne was dropped to help, and the Panzers were stopped by 105mm artillery firing over open sights. HMS Petard was hit by friendly fire from the Warspite, but the sheer weight of naval gunfire and the Allied bombers halted the Germans. Doolittle's bombers annihilated the town of Battipaglia to stop supplies getting through by reducing the town to rubble. The Americans called it putting the city into the streets so that the roads were impassable. On the 12th of September, Scoresny and some Waffen-SS troops in gliders rescued Mussolini and made him head of the Repubblica Sociale Italiana in the hope that the Italians would carry on the fight. On the 21st of September, three French forces landed unopposed to seize Corsica, but at Salerno the fighting still carrying on. The Germans, worried by the advance of the Eighth Army, they finally start to withdraw back to the river Volturno, north of the city of Naples. On the 25th of September, the British Eighth Army and the American Fifth are linked up. At Salerno, the Americans had lost 3,500 casualties. The Germans 5,500, but the Allies had also seized the crucial Foggia Plains and its vital airfields. The Foggia Plains are going to be turned into one giant airfield for which to bomb southern Europe. On the 1st of October, armoured cars of the King's Dragoon Guards enter Naples. Major buildings have been primed with bombs, the water supply destroyed, and libraries burnt by retreating German forces. While Axis forces were fighting for their lives in the east, 77 German divisions, crucial, were all now tied down in Italy, the Balkans, and the Aegean, although those in the Aegean were mostly of people from low medical categories, to try and protect against British invasion. Goebbels and Ribbentrop begged Hitler to begin peace talks. He refused because he said, "I will not negotiate from a position of weakness. We will only negotiate from a position of strength," which effectively means they're not going to negotiate. Meanwhile, the bombing campaign had continued. After the heavy losses over the Ruhr and Hamburg, the US bombers had flown to North Africa to attack the Ploesti oil field, known as Operational Tidal Wave. But the Germans knew that they were coming, having broken the American codes, and they ringed Ploesti with anti-aircraft. Of the 178 liberators sent, only 31 returned in serviceable condition. On the 17th of August, the Americans attacked the ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg with 146 bombers. By now, 400 German fighters protected the Reich, all withdrawn from the Eastern Front. So many US aircraft were shot down, the crew said it looked like a paradrop invasion. 60 bombers were lost, more damaged, but little was achieved. Churchill tried to persuade the Americans to start bombing at night like the RAF. The accuracy rates, by the way, were very similar. People say, the Americans were more accurate by bombing it by day. It's not true, as it happens. The accuracy very similar. But the Americans ignored the advice. What was more dangerous to the Germans, however, were the losses of aircraft in the air, rather than the bombing itself. 334 German fighters were shot down in August, all with experienced pilots that couldn't be replaced. On the 18th of August, General Joschneck, head of the Luftwaffe, shot himself in despair. Now, Bomber Harris, was convinced that he could bomb Germany into submission by the 1st of April 1944. Hitler refused to increase fighter production, instead putting his faith in anti-aircraft guns. And there we stopped for a break. Now, on the 8th of November, the battle for Berlin began. The air battle for Berlin, that is, up until March 1944. Lancaster and Halifax bombers were sent to carpet bomb the city, guided by pathfinders dropping red and green flares, called Christmas trees by the Germans. Each Lancaster was ordered to carry 5 tons of bombs. Goebbels was one of the few Nazi leaders to meet the victims of the raids, earning quite a bit of respect for doing so. It was a battle of attrition. Harris was convinced he could shorten the war. The city was too spread out to be firebombed like Hamburg had. Bomber Command was to lose over 1,000 aircraft in the skies over Berlin. It failed also to break the morale of the German people. He deliberately targeted German people's houses, seeing industrial workers as legitimate targets of war. Despite the US bombing by day, their targeting was even worse in this battle than the experienced crews of the RAF. Hitler ordered retaliatory raids against every three-star building in the Bodecker travel guide, a terrible way to run a war. And so Bath, Canterbury, Exeter, Norwich, York, absolutely crazy. But back on the Eastern Front, here we are. Manstein and Klug asked Hitler to appoint an overall commander of the Eastern Front, but Hitler refused in case they overthrew him. The same day, British troops landed in Italy. He ordered the Donbass region to be held at all costs. It was important for its mining and its mineral wealth. On the 8th of September, you have the German and Russian race for the Dnieper River. It's wide, really wide as a river. We know, of course, how significant it is for the fighting in Ukraine at the moment. And it's also worth noting that the western bank is unusually high compared to the eastern bank, making it excellent for defense against armies invading from the east, of which I'm sure we're all very grateful for at the moment. Now, the defensive line would run from Smolensk to Kyiv and the Black Sea. The Germans managed to get there just in time but they lacked the time to put in a scorched earth policy and had to burn huge piles of their own supplies. They couldn't evacuate in time. On the 22nd of September, the first Soviet soldier crossed the Dnieper River using wooden gates and tarpaulins to float across the river, both north and south of Kyiv. Soviet casualties were absolutely appalling. 3 Soviet parabrigades were dropped on the West Bank, but poor reconnaissance led them being dropped straight on to 2 Panzer and 3 infantry divisions that had been concentrated on that area. It's an absolute massacre. But north of Kyiv, Soviet troops managed to slip across a marshy area the Germans had thought impassable. The Soviet General Vatutin now took a huge gamble on his soldiers' lives, risking the 5th Guards Tank Corps to rush through the marsh. Many T-34s were lost to the marsh, their crews drowning, but some made it through. After fierce fighting in the north, the Germans finally pushed out of Smolensk in September in what was known as the Reserve Offensive, while the Soviet Central Front was approaching the city of Gomel, and the German 17th Army had been cut off in the Crimea, which we can see in the map there, cut off when Perekop falls. While the 5th Guards were crossing marshland, the 3rd Guards Tank Army and the 38th Army were sneaking across the river in the Lizetz bridgehead. Poor German aerial reconnaissance and brilliant camouflage meant the Germans didn't spot them, and Soviet forces soon burst out of the 2 bridgeheads. Pincer in Kyiv, the city fell to the Soviets on the 6th of November, in time for the anniversary of the revolution. Vatutin kept on going, pushing a giant salient 150 kilometers deep and 300 miles wide into the German lines. Here we go, we have him here, Vatutin. Now, not all Ukrainians, however, welcomed the Red Army in, and Vatutin himself would be killed in a Ukrainian ambush. But as the Red Army pushed into the Ukraine, they discovered Kyiv had been the center of a massacre. 100,000 civilians had been killed there, Jews, Roma, and communists, by 1943. On the 28th of November was the Tehran Conference. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met. The British wanted to discuss the future of Poland and the treatment of the beaten states. A European conference on Germany and the treatment of France, Yugoslavia, and Iran after the war. The US wanted a successor organization for the League of Nations, and the Russians wanted an invasion of France and pressure put on Sweden and Turkey to join the war. Now, during the meeting, the Soviets were very impressed by leather-bound photos of German cities bombed by the RAF, but Stalin was determined that France would be punished. He called them collaborators and argued that the surrender of the French army in 1940 had given the Germans the vehicles they needed to invade the USSR in 1941, which is true, although he seems to have forgotten that the invasion of France was only possible because of Soviet oil given to the Germans. Now, Stalin worked well with the US against the British to argue for the invasion of Normandy, and South France must be the priority. The British wanted a landing in the Adriatic to counter Soviet control of the Balkans, but Stalin expertly steered the US Army away from that and praised and promised to launch a major new offensive the day after D-Day. The conference was so exhausting that soon Churchill collapsed with pneumonia. He was in despair at being sidelined by the US and the USSR. He was only cheered by the news on the 26th of December 1943 of the Battle of the North Cape, where the battleship Duke of York sunk the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst as it had tried to attack the Arctic convoys in what is the penultimate engagement of capital ships in naval history. So here you have the Battle of North Cape. And so coming soon after the crippling of the battleship Tirpitz by a mini submarine on the 22nd of September, it meant that the Atlantic was now free of the menace of the German capital ships. In the Ukraine, Manstein was counterattacking, hoping to retake Kyiv and the Dnieper line, trying to encircle Soviet forces. To his horror, however, on the 25th of December, the Red Army brought up the 1st Tanks and 3rd Guard armies and then smashed through his lines, while Konev broke through in the south. 2 German corps were trapped at Korsun on the Dnieper after Hitler refused to let them retreat. Now, back in Italy, there was no clear thinking of what was to be achieved. The British and the head of the US Air Force in the Mediterranean, Spaatz, wanted to push on to get their bombers closer to Germany and possibly make D-Day unnecessary. The US wanted to halt and concentrate on D-Day. Churchill, meanwhile, was obsessed with seizing Rhodes and island hopping his way to Greece. Clark and Monty also did not get on well. Clark believed Monty had been slow to reach him at Salerno. Monty thought that he'd saved Clark and thought Clark was ungrateful. Rommel, meanwhile, had suggested abandoning South Italy and holding just the north, but Kesselring was determined to hold Rome. The Allies crossed the Volturno River and advanced north of Naples, but that autumn was an incredibly wet autumn. Trenchfoot became a problem. The rivers swelled and the Germans blew the bridges. With so many valleys, even the well-equipped US and British with their Bailey bridges were struggling. German anti-tank ambushes meant the advance soon had to be led by the infantry. 30 kilometers north of the Volturno, the Allies reached the Gustav Line and were halted. It was the narrowest strip of Italy, 140 kilometers across and well suited to defense. So we see here the defensive lines in Italy. And so they've fallen back to the Gustav line, that red line you can see in the middle. So it's anchored by the strong point of Cassino. With the withdrawal of 7 divisions for D-Day, the Allies no longer had numerical superiority for a major offensive. The British tried to outflank Cassino and seize Montecomino, but they couldn't dig in on what was known as Murder Mountain and were driven off by murderous artillery fire. The American 34th and 45th Divisions tried to clear minefields by herding goats across them, but trucks were of little use in bringing supplies up in the mountain terrain, and the army was desperately short of mules. On the 2nd of December, the British attacked Murder Mountain again, while the US attacked La Defensa when Montecomino was taken by Clark, and then they sent the 36th to outflank the German centre, led by Italian mountain troops, but they were cut to pieces. Tanks charged up Montlungo, but the tracks were broken by the rocks. After days of heavy losses, the Germans simply pulled back to the next offensive line. To the east, in the east of Italy, in Monti's sector, he was already fighting what is now a completely separate war due to the Apennine Mountains across the middle of Italy. Supplies were short due to shipping prioritizing the buildup of air forces on the plains of Folgia, the US 1st Air Force, to be commanded by Doolittle. Monty recognized that Foggia was a key to bomb Bavaria, Austria, and the Danube, but apart from that, the Germans were simply shoring up their defensive positions. He tried to break through and turn the flanks of the German forces fighting Clark's 5th, but heavy rain had delayed the planned crossing of the Sangro River. Pontoon bridges were swept away by the floods, and tanks could not move, while the DAF, the Desert Air Force, as it was still labelled, could not fly. On the 27th of November, while still raining, the 2nd New Zealand Division crossed and began to fight for the high ground. By the 1st of December, 1st Canadian also attacked along the coast. The commander, Vokes, flung battalion after battalion against the minefields and mountains, earning him the nickname the Butcher. By the 21st of December, the Canadians finally broke through. After another week of fighting, the town of Ottano was finally captured. It was in ruins. The Canadians had lost 2,300 casualties, and Vokes collapsed in tears. On the 2nd of December, a heavy Luftwaffe raid hit Bari, Monty's main supply port. 17 ships were sunk, one carrying 1,350 tons of mustard gas. Such was its severity, such was its secrecy, that the doctors weren't even told what had caused all these injuries, and so many died because they couldn't receive the correct treatment. The port was out of action until February, and it was one of the Luftwaffe's most destructive raids of the war. Over 1,000 soldiers had died. The front locked into trench warfare. At any one stage, 10% of all Allied troops had VD at some stage due to the Italian civilians being close to starvation and doing anything for food. At this stage, both Montgomery and Eisenhower left Italy to prepare for D-Day. Churchill assumed command of the front and leapt at Clark's idea of a new amphibious landing, Operation Shingle. 2 divisions would land behind the German lines at Anzio, 100 kilometers behind the Maref line. There was no rehearsal time, as the amphibs were needed for D-Day in the English Channel. Everything would depend on the Fifth Army crossing the Rapido River, seizing Cassino, and then Mont Cassino. The left would be the British 10th Corps, the right would be the newly arrived French Expeditionary Force, made mostly of North African troops used to mountain conditions. The main thrust would be in the centre, led by the US 2nd Corps. They would be led by the battered 36th Division. It was an unimaginative plan. On the 19th of January, the British crossed the river Garigliano, but the Germans opened up a sluice gate and literally washed the British back to their starting positions. US troops got lost in the mist and suffered 2,000 casualties in a futile attack. But Kesselring hurled his reserves forward, the 29th and 96th Panzer Grenadier, leaving the Anzio sector undefended. The landings would be led by the British 1st Division and US 3rd, and they'd be commanded by Major General Lucas. Clark gave Major General Lucas no clear objectives and told him not to stick his neck out, to secure the beachhead and don't endanger your corps. So let's just move the pictures on. Here we go, the landings of Anzio. On the 22nd of January, they landed unopposed and asked the locals where the Germans were. The locals didn't know. The area had been a marsh, but had been drained before the war, and malaria in the area had been eradicated. However, Himmler, in revenge for Italy's surrender, had re-flooded the area and re-released malarial mosquitoes while destroying a nearby hospital so that people couldn't get malaria treatment. 55,000 Italians had died because of this. The landing force was ordered to stay where it was and not push deeper in, which of course was the main aim of the Anzio landings. The British had expected a rapid advance on Rome and believed that they were held back by the American generals to favour a US advance on the city. Worse, the hills overlooking the beachheads weren't secured, nor even were the German supply lines to the Maref line cut, which was the entire point, of course, of the landing. The Germans, though, were panicking and rushed troops from North Italy, while the Luftwaffe used glide bombs to try and destroy the ships. On the 24th, the advance finally began, but now German artillery was in the hills and its fire was devastating. Hitler was determined to hold Rome and sent Kesselring even more troops. In fact, he sent in more troops than Kesselring had asked for. And by the 28th, the Germans around Anzio outnumbered the Allies. 100,000 Germans faced 60,000 Allies, and the weather had grounded the Allies' air support. The break-in of the Maref line, meanwhile, was not going well. The French had crossed the Secchio and seized Mont Belvedere, but for the loss of 2,000 casualties. On the 30th of January, the 34th finally crossed the Rapido River and tried to advance on Cassino. After days of heavy fighting, it was so badly mauled that they were replaced by the 4th Indian. Freyberg of the New Zealanders took command and decided to flatten Monte Cassino. Now, this was an incredibly controversial decision, but he was convinced wrongly that the Germans had fortified the monastery. At Anzio on the 4th of February, the 4th Panzer Grenadier Forces used a flock of sheep to clear a British minefield and then attacked. In 3 days of heavy fighting, the 1st lost 1,500 casualties, and a breakthrough to the sea was only halted by naval gunfire. Hitler ordered a full assault against hoping that the landings would be destroyed, and hoping that if the landings were destroyed, it would then put the British and Americans off any other amphibious landings, and so would lead to the cancelling of D-Day. At the Marif line on the 16th of February, Monte Cassino was then destroyed by the air. Leaflets warning of the raid had been dropped, but no one had believed it. Hundreds of refugees were killed. There were no troops there. There were a lot of refugees. Freyberg followed it up with a delayed, ill-planned, and weak assault. The Germans had turned the ruins into a fortress. Allied claims that had been fortified before the raid were publicly denied by the abbot of the now flattened monastery. The 2nd New Zealand and 4th Indian also attacked the town, but were halted by heavy rain. Back at Anzio on the 16th of February, the fighting intensified. Panzer Grenadiers attacked in an almost Napoleonic column and were devastated by artillery. Germany suffered 50,000 casualties. Lucas was replaced by the Allied General Truscott. But things had already turned the Allied way around Anzio. On the 29th of February, the Germans attacked again into the face of a 66,000 shell barrage. Kesselring realized the war in Italy had turned. He lacked men and ammunition. At Anzio, 75% of his casualties had been caused by the artillery. On the Marif line, the rain halted on the 15th of March and the US Air Force was sent in. But due to poor navigation, five incorrect towns were bombed, hitting Indian, British, Polish, and French troops, causing 350 Allied casualties. The battle went on for another 8 days, with Freyberg's men fighting badly, but they're badly led, and they suffer twice the casualties the Germans do. More Allied troops are landed at Anzio, but it's trench warfare. Soon, some of the troops had even planted little vegetable plots, so convinced are they that the line is anchored. But the foggier air bases are already proving their worth. Now, Himmler had been trying to set the Bosnian Muslims, recruiting them into the SS against others, and so they were known as the 13th Gayberg Division to fight in Yugoslavia. On the 2nd of March, planes from the Foggier airbase started to directly support Tito's partisans against the German and Bosnian forces. If we return to the Eastern Front, on the 4th of January, Manstein had flown to see Hitler to ask him to evacuate the Crimea and the Dnieper River bend. The 4th Panzer Army was in danger of annihilation. We'll just move our pictures on again. There's the flattened ruins of Monte Cassino. Here's the map of the Eastern Front. And so Hitler refused, saying that if he did evacuate the Dnieper River bend and Crimea, then it might encourage Romania and Bulgaria to leave the war. But 4th Panzer Army was in danger of annihilation. He couldn't weaken the north, he said, also, in case the Finns sued for peace. Manstein then asked Hitler to hand over command of the Eastern Front to him, but Hitler refused. Hitler was increasingly angry that German officers followed Manstein's orders, but not his own. Germany had so far lost 4.2 million men, but still had 9.5 million in uniform. Of these, 2.5 million are on the Eastern Front. But they are facing an absolute horde. They are at least supported, however, by 700,000 Allied soldiers. But many of these are Alsatian, Poles, Czechs, and press-ganged forced labourers. The quality of the troops has now become really, in many cases, very indifferent. The Red Army against them have 6.4 million men on the Eastern Front, but even the USSR is run out of men. They had, however, managed to clear the Germans from Leningrad and were now aiming for the Ukraine and Belarus. That was to be their aim. On the 24th of January, the Soviets attacked near Korsun, encircling 2 German corps, that Manstein had not been allowed to withdraw. And so he gathered the 4th Panzer Division to try and rescue those men in what's known as the Cherkessy Pocket. The troops in the pocket tried to break out in the snow on the 17th of February, but were attacked by T-34s and Cossack cavalry. 20,000 died in a day. And around Leningrad, the Soviets start to attack out of the city on the 14th of January. The troops had been, if we just move on the map, here we go. So troops had also been secretly pushed into the Orenburg pocket to the west of Leningrad, including the 2nd Shock Army. The attack was supported by the Baltic Fleet, 21,600 artillery pieces and 1,500 rockets. 220,000 shells were fired in 100 minutes. On the 22nd of January, General Kruchler asked Hitler to be allowed to retreat from Pushkin. He was sacked and replaced by his favorite general, Model. On the 23rd of January, the last German shell lands on Leningrad. The Soviets advance 200 kilometers. Belgian SS units are hurled into the line, but they're soon pushed back beyond the Narva. As part of the anti-partisan campaign, 50,000 Soviet citizens are herded into no man's land to die. On the 4th of March, Zhukov smashes the German lines in Ukraine and races for the Romanian border, crossing the Dniester and entering Romania. On the 18th of March, hearing that Hungary was trying to negotiate peace with the Soviets, German troops put Admiral Horthy into protective custody and a new government is installed, and the SS round up 750,000 Jews in Hungary. On the 19th of March, German troops enter Budapest, while Hitler summons all the field marshals to see him at Berghof to swear personal loyalty to him. In Russia, the German General Seydlitz, who had been captured at Stalingrad, asked Stalingrad to be allowed to form a 30,000-strong volunteer German army to fly into Germany to kill Hitler. Beria, head of the NKVD, refused permission, saying that it was all part of an elaborate escape plan. On the 30th of March, both Kleist and Manstein were sacked for allowing forces to retreat to avoid encirclement. On the 7th of April, the Red Army captures Perekop, the Perekop Isthmus, the gateway to Crimea. On the 16th of April, Odessa falls, with its German defenders having to flee by sea. And on May, the last 25,000 German and Romanian troops in Sevastopol surrender. Soviet troops are now in Romania, on the Polish and Estonian borders, but the German Army Group Center is holding on in Belarusia. Now, over the skies of Berlin, the battle for Berlin continued. In February, long-range Mustangs had entered the battle, drastically cutting Allied losses. The RAF and USAF also flattened fuel production centers, and the Berlin battles left the Luftwaffe with few experienced pilots left. They had long ago stripped training school of experienced pilots, and the new badly trained pilots were being slaughtered in the air. In France, the French were now fighting a full-scale civil war between the Gaullists, the Gerardists, and Vichy French militia forces. In the planning for D-Day, Eisenhower remained committed to Operation Anvil, the invasion of southern France by the French. The US had spent a fortune equipping the French forces, but amphibs were short, especially after Anzio, and the British were worried that this would weaken D-Day. In Italy, Clark was determined to take Rome before D-Day, but Kesselring had held on for longer than even Hitler had thought possible. Allied morale was low. 30,000 British troops had deserted. US numbers were similar. There were huge numbers of self-inflicted wounds. The Polish, if we see them on the left there, the Polish 56,000 strong force under General Anders took over against Cassino. They were determined to take no prisoners and wanted a spectacular victory to help the cause of a free Poland. In Operation Diadem, there was the assault on the Gustav Line, which would involve 500,000 men from 10 different nations. So that includes the Mexican and Brazilian armies. You can see there the Brazilian soldiers in Italy. A diversionary amphibious operation would draw defenders away, while the assault on the Gustav Line would draw German reserves forward. The Allies would then break out of the Anzio bridgehead northeast towards Volmontagne to cut off the German 10th Army, to encircle it and trap it out of supply. Clark was furious. He didn't care about trapping the German 10th Army. He wanted Rome and was paranoid the British wanted it first. He was prepared to disobey orders to stop that from happening. On the 11th of May, the Polish attacked. Tragically, they attacked while the Germans were rotating units in the front line, so the Germans had twice the number of defenders in the area as usual. Losses were horrible. The 8th Indian bloodily crossed the Rapido and retook San Angelo. In the centre, French forces finally broke through the Gustave line, taking Montmieu for 2,000 casualties. The North African troops took German ears as trophies. Slowly, Polish troops pushed forward, and finally on the 18th of May, the red and white flag of Poland flew over Mont Cassino for the loss of 4,000 casualties. The Germans pulled back 10 to 20 kilometers to the Hitler line, but the French harried them all the way. An 8th Army threatened to punch straight through. Kesselring withdrew his divisions from the Anzio front to try and rescue the situation. This was precisely what Alexander had been waiting for. On the 23rd of May, Truscott and 7 divisions attacked, and after a day's heavy fighting, he broke out and linked up with 5th Army. On the 25th of May, Truscott's first armored, was so close to Valmontone and could trap the 10th Army. This was the great opportunity to encircle the entirety of the 10th German Army and win the war in Italy. However, Clark ordered him to halt and drive on Rome instead, telling him that if the British tried to get in his way or to stop him, he was to open fire upon the British. It is absolutely criminal. They have broken through. The 10th Army is there, ready to be encircled in what would have been one of the great victories of British and American forces, all thrown away by one man's ego. Now, meanwhile, planning for D-Day continued. Seeing the hundreds of pages of instructions for it, the Canadians called it Operation Overboard as opposed to Operation Overlord. But the British were haunted by Dunkirk and Dieppe. There were 5,000 ships, 8,000 planes, and 8 divisions in the first wave. The deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was complex. Fortitude North suggested a British landing in Norway, which meant that Hitler insisted on keeping 400,000 men to stop them. Fortitude South, which involved dummy tanks and landing ships for the First Army Group led by Patton, the general the Germans feared most, was for a landing in the Pas de Calais. Operation Double Cross was intended to convince the Germans that the Normandy landings were a feint and that the real attack was going to be going towards Boulogne. They had learned from the Italian experiences that Germans would be able to build up forces far more quickly than the Allied landing forces, so the area would have to be sealed, with all the bridges and railways destroyed. Anything crossing the Loire to the south or the Seine to the east was blown. To disguise this, aerial attacks swept across France, Belgium, Holland, and even Denmark. Harris was furious at what he considered was a waste of bombers. Spaatz wanted to continue with his oil plan, but the morale of the American Air Force was incredibly low. 90 US bombers flew to Switzerland and Sweden for internment till after the war. Churchill was appalled by the plan to bomb French towns and slaughter French civilians. He pleaded against it, but was ignored. But equally, he didn't want to tell de Gaulle about D-Day, as the British feared the Germans had broken the French old-fashioned codes. Eisenhower ignored him and told the French resistance and a number of French squadrons, ships, and units about D-Day. Roosevelt was clear, however, that they were not invading to install de Gaulle as leader of France, as he wished. He heartily disliked de Gaulle. Churchill just tried to persuade Eisenhower to work with de Gaulle, but Roosevelt wanted to impose a military occupation with its own currency until elections were held. Back in Italy, a US division managed to slip through a gap in the last hasty defense line before Rome, and Kesselring pulled back. Hitler allowed him to declare Rome an open city. On the 4th of June, Clark managed to summon up all the war photographers from the front to Campo di Gallo to photograph him holding a map and pointing north towards the retreating Germans. His corps commanders watched on, cringing with embarrassment, and called him Marcus Aurelius Clarkus. The day after was D-Day. Clark was furious, saying that they couldn't even give him one day on the front page of the newspapers, as if that really mattered at this stage in the war. And here we go, we can see some of the photo shoot of him posing, taking Rome. The Atlantic Wall, however, for Normandy was at places formidable, but it wasn't the line that Hitler thought it was. But to Hitler, this was to be the line that the British and the Americans would be smashed against. He hoped that the D-Day would fail and they'd pull out of the war, allowing the Germans to concentrate against the Russians. Rundstedt, however, was aware of how thin it was in places, and he called it a piece of cheap bluff. Rommel was put in charge of the defences. He knew Allied air power, and he wanted his tanks as close to the beach as possible, as he feared typhoons would rip the tanks apart. Hitler refused to give him command of the tank forces, giving that to the General von Schreckenberg. Now, he concentrated his forces north of Paris, away from the beaches, in the forests, hoping they'd give him some kind of cover. But the right to move these tank forces was reserved for Hitler himself. Rommel was convinced that the invasion was for Normandy and worked tirelessly upon the beach defences there. Hitler, however, kept changing his mind so that afterwards he'd be able to say that he had chosen the correct place for the invasion, that he'd been right all along. But he normally favoured saying that the invasion would be in the Pas de Calais, as it was close to the main Allied air bases and the German V weapon sites. German intelligence said there'd be no chance of an invasion between the 5th and 7th of June due to the poor weather. Rommel decided to take this opportunity, therefore, to go to Germany to see his wife and to ask Hitler if he could have control of those panzers. On the 1st of June, the bombardment battle fleet left Scapa Flow. D-Day was due for the 5th. The weather was so bad on the 4th, it was pushed back a day. It was a brave decision to go ahead with D-Day on the 6th. Any further delay would have been a 2-week delay to wait for the next high tide. As it happens, that would have been the worst storm for 40 years. Had they delayed, therefore, they'd have probably been delayed until 45. On the 5th, RAF squadrons swept the channel. Here we go, the ship's heading towards the beaches. Not one submarine reached the English Channel. 277 minesweepers raced for Normandy, expecting high losses. The paratroopers this time arced over away from the invasion fleet, flying in a huge loop just to avoid being shot at by their own anti-aircraft. Even so, 3 C-47s were shot down by the invasion fleet on their return home. Heavy anti-aircraft fire broke up the paratroop formations. Some were drowned when landing in marshes and rivers. They were scattered everywhere, but this confused the Germans as to their true targets. Only the seizing of Pegasus Bridge by the British gliders went spectacularly well, seizing the crossing on the River Orne. Here it is, guarding the east flank of the invasion. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Sherman tanks were released into much rougher waters than expected, and many drowned. At Utah, the 4th Infantry landed for fewer casualties than expected and began to advance to relieve the 82nd and 101st Airborne. Here we go. At Omaha, the beaches were dominated by bluffs, and the defenses were much thicker than expected. The naval bombardment had been too short. The bombers had missed their targets, as the American Air Force hadn't wanted to bomb their own men, and so fatally delayed the releasing of their bombs, which meant that they simply bombed inland rather than the beach defences. They should have flown along the coast, which would have allowed them to hit their targets, but they were afraid of the anti-aircraft fire. Not one bomb hit a beach defence there, or even made a crater that the American troops could use. Fortunately, the defenders, the 352nd Reserve, of 3,000 men, had been drawn away by exploding puppet paratroopers and were then wiped out by British troops advancing from Gold Beach. Otherwise, it could have been much worse there. Even so, casualties were so bad that Bradley had actually considered evacuating the beach. Only US and British destroyers coming close to shore and firing point-blank fire against German bunkers, and a few Shermans saved the day. At Gold, the 50th Division rapidly pushed ashore. Bayeux fell without a loss. At Juno, the Canadians found it tougher, with fortified seaside villages and tunnels, while at Sword, the British 3rd Division struggled, with an unusually high tide delaying the release of tanks. Minefields then slowed the advance at Caen, as did the defence of a large German bunker system. German paratroopers, however, had blown bridges over the rivers to stop any Panzer counterattacks by the 21st Panzer, which intelligence had failed to spot and was actually deployed around Caen. Caen itself was flattened by RAF bombers, which simply turned it into a rubble-filled strong point, which the Germans could use, while inflicting few casualties. Hitler delayed making any decision until late afternoon. The Allied commanders had shown excessive faith in the firepower of heavy bombers, but had advanced slowly due to fears of counterattacks, as they had underestimated the power of the P-47 and Typhoon fighter bombers, which was devastating the 1st SS Panzer, the 12th SS Panzer, and especially the Panzer Lehr Division. The Canadians rushed forward to deploy their anti-tank guns, while the British 3rd was slow to seize ground when it could have been seized much more quickly and much more cheaply. And the failure to advance further would stop the RAF from building air bases that they wanted to build on shore as quickly as they wanted to. But even so, by the end of the 6th day, the Allies were ashore critically in Normandy. The fighting for Normandy would continue in what was now the race for Berlin, from the British force and American forces in Normandy and the German forces, who were about to begin the biggest battle of the Second World War, Operation Bagration, and the destruction of Army Group Centre. And I hope that I'm sorry that we've had to re-record this. I hope many of you joined us when we did this live in Abingdon Museum. And I hope many of you will join us this November at Abingdon Museum for the final talk on the Second World War and the race for Berlin. Thank you.